1/3 of the way down the western boundary of Illinois, a relatively high promontory of land pushes out into the Mississippi River, causing the stream to make a wide, graceful arc around it. On this promontory stands Nauvoo, 97 miles west of New Salem, where Abraham Lincoln won fame at rail splitting, 75 miles north of Mark Twain's Hannibal, Missouri. Nauvoo, where today one can walk through the town in 5 minutes. Passing the hotel, which has accommodations for the traveler on his out-of-the-way journey, passing the newspaper office where the doings of the town's inhabitants are published once a week. A few cars, a few stores. This is the main street of Nauvoo, Illinois, population 1,000. In the 1830s, land speculators laid out a town along the east bank of the Mississippi, where Nauvoo would later arise, and named it Commerce. A few stores and dwellings were erected, but the panic of 1837 blighted its hopes of becoming a metropolis. From such an old surviving general store, the early inhabitants of Commerce purchased supplies. Surveying the old streets and roads on the flat, now grown over with grasses, one would hardly suspect that here one of the largest cities of Illinois once stood. The half-hidden houses, obscured by brush and vegetation, remind us that these streets once resounded to the laughter of little children, the sound of teams and wagons, the pleasant discourse of man with fellow man. A few of the old houses remain, some with sightless windows, barring from view the changes wrought by neglect and time. No, one would hardly suspect that once here was a busy city. But the evidence of early tragedy reminds us that here men, women, and children died while trying to find a place where they could live in peace. These are the graves of the Mormons who first built Nauvoo and who had been driven from their homes in Missouri by hostile mobs, victims of a cruel persecution. When they sought refuge here on the river's side, thousands came with only the clothes they wore. Everything else was abandoned in the flight from Missouri. Weakened by hardships, they fell prey to mosquitoes and racking fever. The dead were buried here. The living then commenced the building of their city. Crossing the Mississippi from the Iowa side or coming up from Illinois towns to the south, the Mormons bought farmland from some of the early settlers of Commerce, one of whom was James White, the ruins of whose home are visible here. In the spring of 1839, when the Mormons arrived, the ground was so wet that travel on foot was exceedingly difficult, while to drive a team was virtually impossible. With vigor and determination, however, the land was cleared of trees and bushes, ground was drained, and a new city began to emerge. About a mile south of the old site of Commerce, the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith established his residence. He moved his family into a log house which stood near the side of the river. The original structure can still be plainly seen. As the months passed by, Joseph added to his house. From 1839 to 1843, his family lived here. In the meantime, the Mormons surveyed the town site, laid out streets, built homes. Industry, farming, commerce, all began to center around Nauvoo, somewhat to the discomfiture and envy of the older villages and towns in the region. Here was the busiest corner of old Nauvoo. To the northeast of this intersection, a large house was built for the prophet. It was called the Mansion House and was completed in 1843. It also served as an inn or hotel, and for a few brief months it was the center of social activity in Nauvoo. After tragedy had struck the Mormons in Nauvoo, the Mansion House went into a long period of decline. Today, although it appears whole and well kept, only 9 of the original 22 rooms remain. Even while the mansion house was being built, plans were made for a far more pretentious hotel to be erected, the Nauvoo House. It was situated across the street from the mansion house and was to be 4 stories in height, with enough rooms to accommodate a host of expected visitors. The original manuscript of the Book of Mormon was deposited in the cornerstone. A faulty seal allowed moisture to enter the receptacle, and much of the contents was destroyed. Actually, the Nauvoo House was never finished. The walls were never built above the 1st story, and finally they were torn down and the bricks used to build the structure which now exists at one end of the foundation. The early 1840s were busy years for Nauvoo. Many buildings and homes were built, including the old Mills Hotel, which vied with the mansion house for customers. Sidney Rigdon, who for many years was closely associated with Joseph Smith, built his home near to the prophet. After migrating with the Mormons to Illinois, Joseph B. Noble built this house for his family. After the Mormons left Nauvoo, Lucy Mack Smith, the mother of the prophet, lived here for a short time. It was usual with most homes to have a smokehouse in the rear for the preservation of meat. And since well water in Nauvoo was very hard and unsuitable for washing clothes, residents collected soft rainwater in cisterns, necessitating 2 pumps, one for the well, the other for the cistern. Here was published the Times and Seasons, news periodical of the church. It obtained a wide circulation throughout the area, containing not only reports of current happenings, but also doctrinal discourses and treatises. As one remembers, it seems impossible that all this was going on in these now almost deserted streets. Many of the Mormons who settled in Nauvoo had been members of the Masonic fraternity, and on June 24th, 1843, the cornerstone was laid for a Masonic hall. Originally a 3-story building, the lodge rooms were located on the 3rd floor, which was removed in 1884. Its lower floor housed the Nauvoo Theater, and at harvest time it was used as a temporary granary. In addition to Joseph Smith's duties as prophet and president of the church, mayor of Nauvoo, commanding general of the militia, husband and father, he supported his family by operating a general store, of which only the foundation remains. It was one of the earliest brick buildings erected in Nauvoo. In the spring of 1842, on the 2nd floor, the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo was organized. The purpose of the society was to foster the principles of charity and virtue, and to promote the cultural and spiritual growth of its members. The society now numbers more than 300,000 women throughout the world. Joseph Smith announced to the church that they must build a temple to the Lord, and from 1841 to 1845, a stone quarry located near this inlet at the river's edge was the scene of great activity. Men and teams were busily engaged in splitting stone from the quarry to build their temple, a structure peculiar to Mormonism and more important than homes, hotels, or Masonic halls. An imposing and expensive building, it was to be built out of timber and white limestone. The quarry is still in existence, not much changed from the time in 1845 when the last stone was cut and the capstone was set on the temple. This is an artist's portrayal of the building. The site for the temple was a lot at the highest point of ground on the peninsula that was Nauvoo. As early as April 1841, the cornerstones were laid. In the summer of that year, church leaders summoned the resources of all the members of the church to assist in the building. Today, all that is left of the temple at the site is a pile of stones. Archaeologists from Nauvoo Restoration Incorporated are excavating the foundations, locating the cornerstones and other features of the building. On May 1st, 1846, the temple was dedicated. It was a magnificent structure costing upward of $750,000, but the dedication was held in an abandoned city. Nauvoo, which in 1845 was the size of Chicago, contained only 1/10 as many people a year later. Then in October of 1848, an incendiary set fire to the temple. 4 bare stone walls were all that was left. A few years later, a tornado struck the shell of the building and the walls collapsed. During the passing years, stones from the building were put to use in a variety of ways. Ironic perhaps, but temple stones were used to build this little jail. The present-day American Legion Hall used temple stones in its construction. So also this wine cellar. Shortly after the Mormons left Nauvoo, the French Icarian Society acquired much of their land, and their community center was built largely of stone from the temple. It's now the information center for the Nauvoo Restoration Incorporated. A few stones retained their identity, as did this sunstone in the state park. 2 moonstones stand guard over the graves of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. And the question raises itself over and over again, what happened to Nauvoo? Why was it abandoned? What became of Joseph, the prophet? It was this way. On a warm day in June 1844, the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram rode out of Nauvoo, their destination Carthage, county seat of Hancock County. They had agreed to stand trial outside of Nauvoo for their part in the destruction of a newspaper press which had printed scurrilous articles about the Mormons. With a sense of foreboding, Joseph said, "I'm going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I'm calm as a summer's morning. It shall yet be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." It is a matter of record how Joseph and Hiram, together with John Taylor and Willard Richards, were imprisoned in the jail at Carthage, and how on the hot and sultry 27th of June in 1844, a group of more than 100 armed men with blackened faces to hide their identity attacked the jail. Some of them shoved the guards aside and rushed up the stairs where the prisoners were being held. A shot fired through the barricaded door struck Hiram, as did one from the open window, and he fell dead. John Taylor received severe wounds. Willard Richards, strangely enough, was not hit. The prophet rushed to the window as though he intended to jump. A fusillade from both outside and inside struck him at that moment, and his body pitched through the window and plummeted to the ground. He lay there motionless. It all took place in a few minutes, and Joseph the prophet was dead. Someone cried that the Mormons were coming, and the mob melted away. Residents of Carthage fled from their homes, and by nightfall the city was deserted. But the Mormons did not come until later, and then only to carry the bodies of their dead back to Nauvoo. The martyrs lay in state in the mansion house. Secretly, their bodies were removed before the coffins were entombed in the hillside by the temple and were buried during the night underneath the Nauvoo house. Afterward, the bodies were removed to the grounds of the old homestead, to a grave in the cellar of the spring house. Many years later, in 1928, the graves were again opened, and Hiram, Joseph, and Emma, beloved wife of Joseph, were reinterred in their present resting place on the grounds of the old homestead. In the meantime, the sorrowing Mormons took hold of themselves and with renewed vigor rose above catastrophe and heartbreak. Led by Brigham Young, whose home you see here, and the Council of the 12 Apostles, the city resumed its activities. Work on the temple was speeded and Nauvoo expanded. Brigham Young's home, well-built, enduring, exemplifies the steadfast nature of its owner, who but a few months later was to be the guiding power behind the Mormon settlement of the Mountain West. Fully intending to stay in Nauvoo, Brigham Young added 2 rooms to his house in the fall of 1844. Many years later, in 1875, subsequent owners added other portions to the house and dug a new well. Today, through the efforts of Nauvoo Restoration Incorporated, skilled specialists are at work restoring the house to the size and condition in which it was when, in February of 1846, Brigham Young left Nauvoo, never to set foot in the city again. Wilford Woodruff, the 4th president of the Mormon Church, built this home and moved into it in May of 1844. In the fall of that year, he was called to preside over the church in the British Isles. Upon his return to Nauvoo in April of 1846, he sold his home and left Nauvoo the following month. Here was housed the general store operated by Raymond and Louisa Clark. The stars, the round and S-shaped cast iron ornaments on the exterior of the building are simply large washers and nuts fitted to the ends of iron tie rods which run through the houses from wall to wall to brace them against the violent winds encountered in this part of the country. One of the most completely restored homes in Nauvoo is the house once occupied by Heber C. Kimball, friend and confidant of both Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. The house was commenced in May of 1845 and represents the most intricate pattern of bricklaying that has survived in the city, Flemish bond. To the rear of the building are to be found the customary smokehouse, a wash house, and summer kitchen with its original door, which was used for preparing food and washing when it was not desirable to do these chores indoors during the heat of the summer. Elder Kimball, his wife, and 4 children moved into the house in October of 1845. 5 months later, they had to abandon it and start for the west. The furnishings in the room shown here are authentic for the period, although they are not the original from the Kimball household of that day. This was the home of Winslow Farr, 2 of whose sons, Aaron and Lauren Farr, were prominent in the founding and establishment of Ogden, Utah, now the 2nd largest city in that state. Jonathan Browning, who lived in this house, was a gunsmith who apparently invented a repeating rifle while residing here in Nauvoo. Later in Utah, his son, John Moses Browning, following in his father's footsteps, also became a gunsmith and was the inventor of the famous Browning automatic rifles and machine guns. The families of Nathaniel Ashby and Erastus Snow shared this duplex. Erastus Snow's leadership was in large part responsible for the settlement and colonization of southern Utah. It is curious that only one side of the house has been kept in good repair. Here lived Orson Hyde, who, in October of 1841, atop the Mount of Olives, dedicated the Holy Land for the gathering of the Jews. The only surviving 3-story dwelling in Nauvoo was built by David D. Yearsley, a convert to Mormonism from Pennsylvania. The small windows on the top floor are original sash and glass. The Yearsley family left this house before they had the first coat of paint put on the woodwork of the 3rd story. Joseph Coolidge operated a cabinet shop in this building. Following the death of the prophet, he was appointed administrator of his estate. And whatever else may be said of them, the Mormons believed that Nauvoo was to be their home, but circumstances decreed otherwise. In the fall and winter of 1845, so much pressure was brought to bear against the Mormons that to avoid civil war, they decided to abandon Nauvoo and move westward. Disposing of their homes at great sacrifice, they commenced their exodus in the bitter cold of February 1846. Across the river on the ice they toiled. When the ice broke up, they crossed on rafts, barges, boats, anything that would carry a wagon, a few animals, horses, oxen. From February through the spring and into the autumn they went. By the 1st of September 1846, only a few hundred Mormons remained in Nauvoo. These were the aged, the sick, those too poor to buy wagons and teams. They were to be picked up later on return trips by those who had gone on before. But their enemies would not wait. They brought up cannon and shelled the city and finally captured it. The helpless were then driven out of the city, forced across the river into the Iowa Flats. There is more to the story of the Mormons than is revealed in the persecution at Nauvoo and the abandonment of this beautiful city after a life of barely 7 years. One of the epic stories of American colonization centers around the westward trek of the Mormon pioneers from Nauvoo, across the rolling hills of Iowa, over the plains of Nebraska and Wyoming, and into the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. In July of 1847, a valiant company of Mormons struggled into the desert valley of the Great Salt Lake. They were, in reality, but the vanguard of what was the migration of a large city, with its industries, religion, cultural, and social institutions, into the Great Basin of the Rocky Mountains. American history knows no parallel of a community thus transplanting itself. In these mountain valleys, they prospered and grew. Undaunted by hardships, they developed the barren land by irrigation, established commerce and industry, schools and colleges, and stamped indelibly the mark of their culture upon the face of the great American desert. Instead of the evacuation of Nauvoo being an exodus to despair and oblivion, it became an exodus to greatness. The death of Nauvoo, with all its poignant memories, was in reality but the beginning of a new era, where the Mormons, motivated by a great religious faith, transformed a wilderness and made the desert blossom as the rose.